Flying. It's statistically one of the safest ways to travel in the world, but aircraft are complex machines, and sometimes things don't go according to plan. From navigational errors, landing in the wrong places, and falling asleep at the controls, it's time to count down the top 15 most reckless pilot mistakes in aviation history. Starting with number 15, opening the door midair. Most of us have at some point been in a car when an alarm sounds to warn us that a door isn't closed properly, and it's a fairly simple thing to fix. You carefully pull to the side of the road and then you can check to make sure all the doors are shut properly. Things are far more complicated when you're flying an aircraft though, and this footage shows just how terrifying things can quickly become. A training pilot was having a lesson above Salt Lake City International Airport in Utah when a sensor malfunctioned showing the door was open. They checked everything prior to the departure and were downwind from the runway when this happened. And knowing that the door was actually shut, the instructor told the trainee to jiggle the handle in an attempt to see if the sensor would then detect it as being closed. Unfortunately, he moved the handle too much and instead unlatched it. Because they were airborne at the time, the force of the air passing outside pulled the door fully open, and it took his full strength to pull it back again. Even with the door mostly closed, he was unable to turn the latch, so the instructor had no choice but to land the aircraft while the trainee kept a tight grip on the handle. It's an event that would have been so much worse than how it ended up being, and luckily both people on board were unharmed, with perhaps the most surprising thing being that they were ready to take to the skies immediately after fully securing the door, without any fear after what had just happened. Number 14. The wrong airport. The Boeing C-17 Globemaster III is an enormous military transport aircraft that measures 174 feet or 53 meters long, and it's got a wingspan of just under 170 feet or about 52 meters. With the ability to carry around 80 tons of cargo, it requires 2 pilots and very careful planning, because with this size and weight, only certain landing strips are this long and sturdy enough for it to use. Now, despite all the technology on board to aid with navigation, mistakes sometimes happen, and in July of 2012, the pilots found themselves within moments of disaster. A C-17 was heading towards MacDill Air Force Base in Florida, but neither of the pilots had made this approach before. About 5 miles or 8 kilometers before the Air Force Base is the much smaller Peterborough Knight Airport, which has a runway with a heading of 220 degrees, exactly the same at MacDill, and the pilots thought that this was where they were meant to land. Footage shows the Globemaster making its final descent, and you can only imagine how the pilots must have felt when they had a better visual of the landing strip. Instead of just being the 11,000 feet or 3,300 meter minimum length the C-17s usually operate on, this one was just 3,405 feet or just over 1,000 meters long. Nearby residents later reported hearing the 4 Pratt & Whitney PW2000 engines screeching in reverse, and it almost seemed inevitable that the aircraft would go off the end of the runway and into Tampa Bay. Amazingly though, the pilots managed to slow down just in time with only a few feet of runway left ahead of them. They were relieved of duty and later determined to have been exhausted, which led to the mistake. And after a new crew arrived, the C-17 reversed back to the start of the runway, and after having cargo and excess fuel removed, managed to take off from the airport and finally land at the Air Force Base as had originally been intended. Number 13. Forgetting the landing gear. When you're flying a plane, it's the takeoff and landing that pose the greatest risks, and there are times when pilots have to fully concentrate. There's a number of controls and measurements they have to be aware of, such as the airspeed, the rate of descent, and the angle of approach. And the cockpit can be a noisy place with different alerts sounding. For most of us, it could easily be a stressful situation where we might forget to do something. But that's why pilots have to go through extensive training before they're allowed behind the controls. Still, sometimes even the most experienced people can make mistakes, and this footage shows one of the most basic errors of all. It was recorded from the cockpit of a small passenger plane as it approached the Muguet Altiport in France. Its landing strip at an elevation of 4,800 feet or about 1,400 meters above sea level, and as a destination in the Alps, it's surrounded by mountains. The pilots on the day had thousands of flight hours and were as experienced as they come in the region, having flown this route for a long time. But for some reason, they failed to acknowledge the alarms that were sounding. It turns out that these are alarms that they probably hadn't heard before, and they would have checked all their instruments to find that everything looked normal. What they hadn't realized at this time, though, was that they had completely forgotten to extend the landing gear, so when the aircraft finally touched down, it skidded along the runway. Somehow, no one on board was hurt in the incident and everyone was able to climb free. The aircraft, though, wasn't as fortunate, and there was some severe damage to the propeller and the underside that had taken the brunt of the landing. The crew had to enlist the help of a local tractor driver to pull the plane off the runway, and needless to say, it was a long time until it was ready to fly again. Number 12. Plane versus hangar. When a plane is airborne, there are very few obstacles for pilots to worry about. Air traffic control will let them know where other aircraft are and pilot routes to ensure that they avoid them. And beyond that, their only real concerns are the weather patterns that develop and potential turbulence, maybe a mountain range or two. Things are, though, very different during landing and takeoff when planes fly over built-up areas, and there are so many things to take into account that it's clear why pilots need so much training before they're licensed to go out on their own. During landing, for example, you need to take into account potential headwinds, control your speed, and gently drop down onto the runway. And something unpredictable can happen at any moment. That's exactly the situation a student pilot found themselves in at the Boutonville Airport in Ontario, Canada in August of 2020. He was on his first solo flight and had touched down flat on the runway in a Cessna aircraft. But at that moment, he appears to have been hit by a gust of wind and lost control, with the aircraft beginning to veer left. It's believed that this is when he decided to abort the landing and power up the engine to go back into the air for a go-around before attempting to land again. But the plane had other ideas. The increase in power overcompensated for the steering, and the plane turned right and began bouncing across the runway and the field next to it before colliding with a nearby hangar. There was very little the student pilot could do to prevent the accident once the initial mistake had been made, and the aircraft was a complete write-off. And the hangar was severely damaged too. Luckily, even though the pilot was taken to hospital as a precautionary measure, he still had no serious injuries and was released later that day. Number 11. Landing at an unfinished airport. Once air travel became accessible to the masses, countries around the world began to develop new airports to accommodate this new form of travel. Featuring everything in one place to make a journey as seamless as possible, the increasing number of passengers means that most are continually being expanded. There are some places where expansion isn't possible, though, and where an entirely new airport has to be built. But in one case, an airport was being so close to an existing one, and with a runway in the same direction, that a pilot managed to confuse the two. Flight ET-3891, operated by Ethiopian Airlines, was a cargo service traveling from the capital of the country, Addis Ababa, to the Simon Mwanza Kapwepwe Airport in Ndola in April of 2021. As the pilot was coming in to land, he was talking to air traffic control at the airport, who said that they couldn't see him, so he had no choice but to continue down towards the runway by sight. It was only when he had come to a full stop that he realized that there wasn't a functioning airport around him, and instead, one was still being built. As rather than reaching his intended destination, he had landed at the Copperbelt International Airport, which is around 13 miles or 21 kilometers away. Luckily, the runway had already been finished, so it was a perfectly safe landing, but it shows just how easy it can be to make a navigational mistake, even with all the technology at hand. Number 10. Accidentally announcing a crash. There's a few things you definitely don't want to hear when you're flying, and while it's devastating to hear that your chosen meal has run out and you got no choice but to have the option nobody wanted, being told that you need to prepare for a crash landing is surely everyone's worst nightmare. That's what the passengers on a British Airways flight from Miami to London in 2012 were faced with. A few hours into the flight at 3 in the morning, and while at an altitude of 35,000 feet or 11,000 meters above the Atlantic Ocean, what most people don't realize is that instead of being announced by the pilot, these messages are often relayed to passengers from a recording, which allows the pilots to focus on dealing with the problem at hand. After the message saying to prepare for a water landing had played twice, the passengers reacted just as you'd expect. There was panic, screaming, crying, and praying, with everyone being forced to come to terms with the idea that this was an extremely dangerous situation. That was until one of the flight crew then began the announcement over the intercom to tell everyone not to worry, and the message had been played by mistake. It turned out that one of the pilots had accidentally pushed the emergency button without realizing it, and it was only when one of the crew told them what had played out that they saw what they had done. Needless to say, the passengers were a bit anxious for the remainder of the flight, particularly as they weren't told the full story about what had happened until they safely landed in London. Number 9. Landing on a river. You may have heard times when pilots have been forced to land on a highway because of an emergency, but what about accidentally mistaking a river for a runway? Well, in late December of 2023, that's what the 23 passengers on board an Antonov An-24 aircraft saw from their windows, with them all wondering where the airport buildings were. The Polar Airlines flight had left the city of Yakutsk, which is the capital of the Sakha Republic in the far east of Russia, and was heading toward Zyryanka, which is about 685 miles or 1,100 kilometers to the northeast. This, of course, is an incredibly cold part of the world, close to the Arctic Circle, and with temperatures that often drop to negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit and negative 40 Celsius, and has a landscape that's covered in snow and ice. It's believed that the pilot on approach to the airport saw the straight, flat river which was frozen over and covered with ice, and thought it to be the runway for the airport, which wouldn't have looked all that different. Luckily for everyone on board, the ice was thick enough to hold the weight of the plane, which skidded through the snow and came to a stop in a sandbank. The pilot would have almost certainly realized the mistake before making the landing, but by that time was already committed to touching down, and without any grip beneath the wheels, had to slide on the ice and hope for the best. Rescuers soon arrived on the scene, then the pilot was arrested, with prosecutors planning on charging him with dangerous operation of an aircraft. Number 8. Landing at the wrong airport again. The technology available to pilots in a small aircraft is usually fairly limited, but those operating larger passenger jets have a number of systems available to them to ensure they stick to the correct flight path and avoid any potential issues along the way. Even with all this, mistakes do still happen, with a plane making quite a substantial detour in Nigeria in November of 2023. With hundreds of passengers on board, the United Nigeria Airlines flight had departed from Lagos and was headed towards the country's capital city of Abuja. Everything seemed to have gone well with the flight, and once they had landed at their destination, the announcement was made that they had landed in Abuja. Eagle-eyed people on board soon noticed, though, that Abuja Airport looked very different to how they remembered, and that's when everyone began to realize, instead of landing there, they had instead touched down at the Asaba Airport, which was around 200 miles or 320 kilometers in the wrong direction. Rather than a small diversion, this was a significant detour, and along with the mystery surrounding why this happened, there also seemed to be confusion about how it had happened. Rumors began to spread that the pilot had either entered or been given the wrong flight plan, but then an airline representative announced that it was completely intentional and that the flight had been diverted from its original destination because of a storm that had developed over the airport. The only mistake, they said, was failing to announce this to the passengers, but not everyone was convinced by this excuse. Soon after, Nigeria's Civil Aviation Authority initiated an investigation into the incident, having found no reports of storms and suspecting the airline was trying to cover up a mistake. So far, the official explanation has yet to be published, but most experts believe it was a case of pilot error by entering the wrong destination when preparing the flight plan. Number 7. Running out of fuel. There are plenty of checks that pilots are meant to perform before taking to the skies, and these are designed to minimize any chance of problems once you're in the air. After all, it's far more difficult to solve an issue in a plane than it is in a car, for example. For those new to flying, though, or who are less experienced, it's more common to overlook something vital, and the consequences can be extremely dangerous. In September of 2021, two friends went to an airport in North Carolina to purchase a Piper PA-16, and after checking the vehicle, filled both of the fuel tanks and spent the night in a hotel. The following day, they went to pick up their plane to fly it home. After checking over the plane once more, they headed off on their journey. They were flying at an altitude of about 4,500 feet and had been going on for about 3 hours. For the first half of this time, they had used the right-hand fuel tank and had used the left side tank for the second 90 minutes, but then the engine stopped running. They switched back to the right fuel tank and kept going for a few minutes before stopping again, leaving them with the realization that they had completely run out of fuel. They were left with no choice but to make an emergency landing on a logging road near Greensboro in Georgia, and once they had touched down, they checked the fuel tanks to confirm that they were indeed completely empty. An official investigation found no leaks in the tanks or problems with the fuel system, meaning this incident was classed as a pilot error, not having correctly performed the pre-flight checks and crucially failing to ensure there was enough fuel on board for the planned flight. They were lucky that day that the weather was clear enough and that there was an empty road that was safe to land on, because had they been just a few miles in any other direction, things could have been catastrophic. Number 6. Is that a runway or a highway? For new pilots, one of the trickiest and most important skills that needs to be learned is being able to recognize features on the land below. Not only does this help you with navigation, but when you reach your destination, it's vital for being able to see the runway and set up your approach. But sometimes, things don't go exactly to plan. In January of 2022, a new pilot with just 233 hours of flying experience was conducting his first solo nighttime flight from Newcastle International Airport in northern England. The 71-year-old had been a good student up until that point and was meant to do a short loop from the airport and fly around to land again. With the complication of it being at night, though, he lost his bearings and had drifted south of the airport on his approach. He was frantically searching for the runway to land the Cessna F-172M light aircraft, and after spotting lights, began to descend to around 300 feet or about 91 meters. It was at this point that the pilot realized that instead of heading toward the runway, he was following the lights of a nearby highway. It just so happened to be one of the busiest in the region and was full of fast-moving cars, despite it being late at night. He immediately began to pull up, and upon noticing his erratic altitude, air traffic control from Newcastle Airport contacted him to instruct him to continue his ascent. They then kept in communication with him to help him turn his aircraft around and regain his bearings, so he was finally able to make a safe landing on the correct runway. As he was the only person on board, he was the only one at risk during what was classified as a near-miss event, and following an extensive debrief on the ground, he was cleared to continue with his nighttime flight training. Number 5. Oxygen mask mistake. When you're settling into the cabin, right, the crew takes you through the safety procedures just in case there's an emergency during the flight. But while every traveler may be familiar with the brace position, the nearest exits, and the oxygen masks, no one truly expects to need to know all of this. If there's a loss of pressurization and the masks drop, though, there's only a limited amount of time to properly fit it to ensure you can continue breathing, and the simple fact of it happening is sure to frighten people and lead to scared and anxious responses. In April of 2019, passengers on board a British Airways flight between Singapore and London were around 2 hours into their journey and had likely gotten a descent way through their first movie on the entertainment system when things took a turn for the worst. First, they noticed that the lights and all the screens suddenly turned off, and the oxygen masks dropped along with a pre-recorded announcement that they needed to be worn. As you might expect, panic ensued and the passengers sat there fearing for their lives, breathing through the masks. Even worse was the fact that not all of the masks had deployed properly, and some people were left without access to one of the life-saving devices. Several minutes had passed and nothing happened, nor were there any further announcements. And then they saw the cabin crew returning to their duties. Eventually, the passengers were told that the masks had been released by accident and that they were in the process of rebooting the systems. Despite the experience they had all gone through, the passengers didn't receive any communication from the pilot for hours until the plane finally landed, and the only reassurance they received was from one of the flight attendants who said, "Don't worry, we'll make it." Some received emails from the airline mid-flight to apologize what had happened, but for the majority, it was only once they reached the terminal building that they learned what had actually happened. With the masks being triggered by a button in the cockpit, it's a serious mistake to have been made. But as well as the initial incident, the lack of clarity to everyone on board made a scary situation all the more frightening. Number 4. False alarm. Now, you'd normally expect that when a pilot makes a mistake, it's just those that are on the aircraft that will be affected. But an incident in November of 2019 showed that the actions of one person in a cockpit can actually interrupt the plans of tens of thousands of people. Amsterdam Schiphol Airport is one of the busiest in Europe, not just because of the people wanting to visit the city itself, but because it was designed to be an easy-to-use hub for making connections. With so many flights each day, every operation in the airport is meticulously planned, but everything was about to be thrown into chaos. Suddenly, airport security, anti-terror police, and emergency service personnel began flooding into the terminal buildings. The gates were shut, the roads approaching the airport were closed, and the entire airport was essentially locked down. This was all in response to a hijacking on an Air Europa plane that was at its gate and meant to be shortly taking off on a route to Madrid in Spain. Soon after, a meeting in the Dutch government was cancelled so officials could help with the situation, and TV broadcasts began revealing information about the hijacking, including the fact that the perpetrators had somehow managed to get weapons past security. Half an hour later, however, the airline released an apology for what had happened, and that one of the pilots in their pre-flight check had accidentally pushed the alarm that automatically triggers hijacking protocols at the airport. There were no hijackers, there had been no terror attack, and instead this was simply a false alarm. By that time, though, the damage had been done. Flights had been canceled and passengers had been sent away from the airport. and even though the flights resumed soon after, it took several days to make up the backlog that the incident caused. While everyone was surely relieved that they were safe, you can't imagine many of the people who were affected would have accepted the profuse apologies from the airline. Number 3. Sleep flying. So most of us know from driving that there can be certain behaviors that can increase your chances of an accident, such as drinking alcohol or traveling when you're extremely tired. And while these can lead to serious consequences, it's even worse if you're responsible for flying a plane. As well as performing pre-flight checks on the aircraft systems, many passenger airlines require checks for their pilots too. But in 2018, something shocking happened that fortunately was resolved without becoming a terrible tragedy. A Piper PA-31 Navajo Chieftain aircraft was being flown by a commercial pilot working for Vortex Air in Australia and had departed Devonport in Tasmania early in the morning. It was only meant to be a short flight to King Island and the Bass Strait, but air traffic controllers began suspecting something wasn't right when the pilot failed to respond to them during the flight. The aircraft reached its destination, but instead of landing, kept going, and it was only once it had flown another 29 miles or 47 kilometers that the ATC was finally able to make contact with the pilot. It turned out that at some point during the flight, the pilot had fallen asleep and the plane remained under the control of the autopilot. It's lucky that he was woken by the radio message, because if that hadn't happened, it's likely the plane would have kept going until it hit an obstacle or ran out of fuel. The investigation that followed discovered that this had been the pilot's first flight after an extended period of leave, and that he had been up late the night before because of an argument at home. While he was ultimately to blame for the incident, the airline also had some responsibility too, as the Air Safety Board found that they hadn't sufficiently checked that the pilot was safe to fly. New procedures have now been put into place to hopefully avoid this from ever happening again, because on this occasion, it was down to luck that there wasn't a serious accident. Number 2. Crash for views. In the increasingly online world that we live in, people will do most anything to get more views or clicks or gain recognition. And this has led to a series of terrible decisions, perhaps none so reckless as what Trevor Daniel Jacob did in 2021. He posted a video titled, "I crashed my airplane," which showed him departing an airport in Lompoc in a Taylorcraft BL-65 and heading toward Mammoth Lakes in California. Around 35 minutes into it, while it was above a forest, he filmed himself jumping clear of the plane and parachuting to safety, while the aircraft plummeted and crashed. Soon after, he went to the crash site to retrieve cameras that were recording the incident, and it was once he posted this video that the authorities became aware that, rather than being an accidental crash, this one had been done on purpose for entertainment. Of course, this is far from being the first time an aircraft has been destroyed on camera like this, but when it's done for the movies and for the clicks, there's a long list of safety and environmental precautions that need to be taken for it to be legal. In this case, none of that planning had been done, meaning the pilot had no clue that it would be any people in the location where the plane ultimately landed, nor did he consider the potential damage to the forest below. He was therefore arrested for what he had done, good, and admitted to everything. He had to pay for the wreckage to be fully removed, had his pilot's license temporarily revoked until he could prove he was responsible, and remains an outcast in the flying community in California for doing something so dangerous and reckless. What an idiot. Number 1. Hitting an aircraft carrier. Landing a plane on a flat runway can be tricky enough, but for pilots, the most difficult and potentially dangerous type of landing is on an aircraft carrier. Of course, military pilots are extensively trained for maneuvers like this, but with extra considerations like needing to be aware of how the carrier is rising and falling on the waves. There's always a greater degree of risk. This became very apparent in January of 2022 when footage was leaked of an incident with an F-35C Lightning II fighter aircraft as it was landing on the USS Carl Vinson in the South China Sea. At first, it seems like any other approach, but then the jet bounces as it first touches down and then skids along the flight deck before falling into the ocean, causing the loss of the $115 million aircraft. Hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of damage to the deck, millions of dollars worth of damage to a jet that it crashed into, and several minor injuries to the pilot and some of the deck crew. At first, you may think this is just one of the risks you face when operating in an environment like this, but the subsequent investigation found that this was all down to pilot error. Rather than attempting a typical landing, he instead decided to perform a specialized landing known as a Sierra Hotel break. It's famous for being a real show of force that involves the aircraft roaring over the aircraft carrier before coming around to land, and gives the pilot far less time to correctly configure the jet and perform the necessary checks. It was the first time this pilot had attempted this, and in this event he was unable to complete the checks, which led to a huge mistake. He didn't activate the electronic aids that are designed to assist with landings, such as the approach power compensation mode, which keeps the plane at the right angle, and the delta flight path, which adjusts the throttle. This meant that the jet approached too slowly, meaning its belly struck the carrier's ramp and a missile bracket caught the landing wire, which sent the aircraft spinning across the deck. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you next time. Thank you to our channel members.